giant mountain man hadn't touched a woman in 10 years, until she collapsed on his porch. That's how it begins. A man who vanished from the world and a stranger who falls into his life like a storm. Folks say he chose silence, but what happens when silence is broken by a woman carrying more than her own weight? Out here, the snow buries secrets, but some truths refuse to stay quiet. Now, with eyes watching from the shadows and the wind holding its breath, one man must decide. Will he stay hidden or stand for something that could save them all? Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The winter wind howled across the snow-covered clearing as Silas McGraw's axe bit deep into another log. His broad shoulders moved with mechanical precision, splitting wood as the sun sank behind the distant mountains. 10 years of solitude had carved his days into simple routines. Chopping, hunting, surviving. The steady thunk of steel against wood echoed through the gathering dusk, keeping time with his thoughts. A movement caught his eye. Through the swirling snow, a dark figure stumbled toward his cabin. Silas gripped the axe handle tighter, his heart pounding against his ribs. He hadn't spoken to another soul since that terrible day, preferring the company of wind and wolves to human voices that might stir painful memories. The figure weaved unsteadily, like a wounded deer. Silas watched, frozen in place, as the stranger reached the edge of his porch and crumpled face first into the fresh powder. The axe slipped from his fingers, landing with a muffled thud in the snow. His feet carried him forward before his mind could protest. Up close, he saw it was a woman, her clothes torn and frosted with ice. Dark hair spilled from beneath a worn shawl, and her fingers were curled around a leather satchel. Even through his thick calluses, he could feel how cold she was when he gathered her into his arms. Inside the cabin, Silas laid her gently by the pot-bellied stove. His hands shook as he added logs and stoked the flames higher. The woman's face was pale as milk, her lips tinged blue. Frost sparkled on her eyelashes and cheeks. "Miss?" His voice cracked from disuse. "Can you hear me?" She didn't stir. Silas ran his fingers through his beard, fighting down panic. What would Clara have done? His late wife had been a healer, always knowing just what to do. The memory of her steady hands guided his own as he pulled worn blankets from the chest by his bed. Working quickly, Silas checked her for injuries. Her fingers and toes showed signs of frostbite, angry red patches that worried him. He remembered Clara's teachings about warming frozen flesh slowly, so he didn't rub or apply direct heat. Instead, he wrapped her in layers of wool, positioning her near enough to the stove for gradual warming. As he unlaced her beaded moccasins, something slipped from her loosened grip. A small silver locket bounced once on the plank floor before spinning to a stop in a shaft of fading daylight. Silas's breath caught in his throat. The locket's familiar shape sent a jolt through his chest. With trembling fingers, he picked it up, turning it over in his palm. The delicate scrollwork around the edges, the tiny nick near the clasp. He knew every detail by heart. It was Clara's locket, the one she'd worn every day of their marriage, the one that had disappeared along with everything else in the fire that took her and their infant son. Silas sank onto his knees beside the unconscious woman, the locket burning like ice against his skin. Questions thundered through his mind. How had this stranger come to possess Clara's locket? What twist of fate had brought her to his door of all places, carrying this piece of his past? The woman stirred slightly, her brow furrowing. In the firelight, Silas could see features that spoke of Cherokee heritage in her high cheekbones and the curve of her nose. Her clothes, though damaged by the elements, showed careful craftsmanship, a mix of settler and tribal styles that suggested someone who walked between two worlds. He tucked the locket into his shirt pocket and set about brewing willow bark tea, another remedy learned from Clara. The familiar motions of caring for someone else felt strange after so many years alone, like speaking a language long forgotten. Each time he glanced at the woman's face, questions bubbled up inside him, but he forced them down. First, she needed to survive the night. As darkness settled over the cabin, Silas pulled his chair close to the stove. The woman's breathing had grown stronger, more regular, and some color had returned to her cheeks. He found himself studying her features, searching for any clue that might explain how she'd come to carry Clara's locket through the wilderness to his door. The wind rattled the window panes and whistled through the cabin's chinked logs. Silas added another log to the stove, watching sparks dance up the pipe. 10 years he'd spent hiding from the world, carrying his grief like a stone in his chest. Now the world had followed him home, bearing questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. The night wrapped the cabin in sheets of white as the blizzard raged. Silas tended to his unconscious guest with quiet determination, changing cool cloths on her forehead as fever set in. Every hour he spooned water between her cracked lips, watching her face for signs of improvement. The woman muttered in her delirium, sometimes in English, sometimes in Cherokee, words he couldn't understand but recognized from trading posts years ago. Near midnight, her fever peaked. Silas remembered Clara's teachings about fever breaking, how the darkness before dawn was often worst. He mixed honey with dried elderberries, coaxing small amounts into her mouth. His large hands, more accustomed to splitting logs than nursing, moved with surprising gentleness. The first gray light of morning crept through frosted windows. The woman's eyes fluttered open, dark and wild with fear. She tried to sit up, but weakness pulled her back against the quilts. Her gaze darted around the cabin, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Easy now," Silas said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe here?" She pressed herself against the wall, chest heaving. "Who are you? Where am I?" "Name's Silas McGraw. Found you collapsed in the snow." He moved slowly to the stove, giving her space. "Made some broth, if you're able." The woman watched him with wary eyes as he ladled steaming liquid into a tin cup. Her hands trembled as she accepted it, but she didn't drink. "I'm Miriam," she said finally. "Miriam Redbird?" She took a careful sip of broth, color returning to her cheeks. "I'm much obliged for your help, Mr. McGraw, but I can't stay. There are men looking for me." Silas settled into his chair, keeping his distance. "Storm's still blowing. Ain't safe to travel." Miriam's shoulders slumped as she recognized the truth in his words. She took another sip of broth before speaking again. "I'm a midwife. Work with both settler and Cherokee families." Her voice grew stronger. "There's a spring on tribal land. Been in my mother's family for generations. Railroad man named Victor Ames, he's trying to steal it." Silas nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. "I filed a deed at the land office, proving tribal ownership." Her hand went to her satchel, panic crossing her face until she found it beside her. "Ames sent men to stop me from registering it. Had to run." She pulled out a rolled parchment, hands shaking. "If anything happens to me, this deed needs to reach the tribal council." Silas accepted the document, careful not to tear the delicate paper. "I'll keep it safe," he promised, tucking it into a high shelf. Miriam relaxed slightly, though exhaustion lined her face. "Thank you." She hesitated, then asked, "Did you find anything else when you brought me in?" Silas's heart quickened. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the silver locket. "This yours?" Miriam's eyes filled with tears. "It was my grandmother's. I never met her, but my mother gave it to me before she died." She held out her hand, and Silas returned the locket. "That locket belonged to my wife, Clara," he said quietly. "Lost her in a fire 10 years back, along with our son." Miriam's fingers traced the locket's edge. "I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Open it." With trembling hands, she worked the tiny clasp. Inside was an inscription Silas had never seen. "To Clara, from your secret." "My mother was born before Clara married," Miriam explained softly. "She was given to a Cherokee family to raise. Clara would visit in secret, bring her little gifts." She met Silas's stunned gaze. Which means you're my step-grandfather? Silas felt the room tilt. He gripped the arms of his chair, trying to steady himself. Clara had never mentioned a daughter, never hinted at this secret past. But looking at Miriam now, he could see echoes of his wife in the shape of her eyes, the gentle set of her mouth. All these years? He managed finally. I thought I was alone. Mother told me about you, Miriam said. How kind you were to Clara, how you made her happy in her last years. She closed the locket carefully. I never thought I'd find you, especially not like this. Silas stared into the stove's flames, mind reeling with revelations. The granddaughter he never knew he had, carrying Clara's locket and a deed that could save her people's water rights. After 10 years of isolation, the world had dropped a family and a fight right at his door. Miriam watched him process, her own exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. The storm continued to howl outside, but inside the cabin something long frozen had begun to thaw. Morning light pierced the cabin windows as the storm's fury finally died. Miriam stood at the window, watching snow settle on bent pine branches. Her fever had broken, but worry lined her face as she gathered her belongings. I need to reach town before Ames's men find me, she said, wrapping her shawl tighter. The protest must be filed within 3 days of the deed, or it won't stand in court. Silas frowned from his chair by the stove. Roads'll be drifted over. Ain't safe yet. Then I'll walk through the drifts. Miriam's jaw set with determination. I've come too far to let Ames steal what belongs to my people. She reached for the door, but Silas's large frame blocked her path. You'll freeze before you make it halfway. Then that's my choice to make. Her eyes held the same stubborn fire he remembered in Clara's. I won't ask you to break your solitude, Mr. McGraw. You've done enough already. Silas watched her shoulder her leather satchel, knowing she meant to step into certain death. The thought of returning to his quiet life while Clara's granddaughter perished in the snow twisted something deep in his chest. Wait, he said, voice rough. Got an old mule cart in the barn. Might need some fixing, but it'll get us there. Miriam turned, surprise softening her features. Us? Silas nodded, already pulling on his heavy coat. Can't let you go alone. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey. Silas hitched his mule, Benjamin, to the cart while Miriam packed supplies, dried meat, water skins, extra blankets. The old cart groaned as Silas tested the wheels, but it would hold. As they set out, the morning sun cast long shadows across untouched snow. Silas handled the reins with practiced hands, though his shoulders remained tense. 10 years of avoiding human contact hadn't prepared him for this. Miriam seemed to sense his discomfort, but rather than press him for conversation, she filled the silence with stories of the territory. Her voice carried over the crunch of wheels through snow, painting pictures of the changing frontier. Ames isn't the first to poison wells to drive folks off their land, she explained. 3 families lost their homesteads last spring when their water turned bad. Railroad men claimed it was natural, but everyone knew better. Silas listened, his jaw tightening at each new tale of injustice. The territory he'd left behind had grown darker, greed wearing new masks but carrying the same cruel intentions. Most folks are too scared to speak up, Miriam continued. Dry Creek's dying slow, caught between railroad promises and railroad threats. Even the marshal looks the other way when Ames's men come calling. The cart crested a hill, revealing the vast white expanse ahead. Silas kept his eyes on the trail, but his mind churned with memories of the town he'd fled. Would they remember him as the giant who'd lost his family? The man who'd retreated to the mountains rather than face his neighbor's pity? Near midday, they passed the old Watson ranch. Hoofbeats approached from behind, and Silas tensed as a rider drew alongside their cart. Lord above, the rider gasped. Silas McGraw? Silas recognized Tom Peterson, a rancher who'd helped search for Clara and their son after the fire. The years had turned Tom's hair gray, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Tom, Silas managed, nodding stiffly. Never thought I'd see you come down from that mountain, Tom said, staring as if he'd seen a ghost. Without waiting for a response, he wheeled his horse around and galloped toward town. Word will spread fast, Miriam said softly. Silas gripped the reins tighter. Reckon so. They continued in silence, the mule's steady pace marking time. Silas felt exposed on the open road, raw in a way he hadn't since those first months after the fire. But each time he glanced at Miriam, saw Clara's determination in her profile, he knew he couldn't have chosen differently. The sun hung low when they spotted chimney smoke on the horizon. Dry Creek waited ahead, and with it, all the human connections Silas had spent 10 years avoiding. He drew the cart to a halt, needing a moment to steady himself. Miriam touched his arm gently. Thank you for doing this. I know what it's costing you. Silas nodded, unable to find words. Then he flicked the reins, guiding Benjamin forward. Whatever waited in town, he'd face it. Clara's granddaughter needed him, and this time he wouldn't turn away. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Dry Creek's main street as Silas guided the mule cart between weathered buildings. Windows creaked open, and faces pressed against dusty panes. The town had shrunk since his exile, with several storefronts boarded up and paint peeling from once proud facades. A woman dropped her basket of eggs when she spotted him. "Saints preserve us," she gasped. "It's Silas McGraw." The name rippled through the gathering crowd like wind through prairie grass. Silas hunched lower on the wagon seat, his massive shoulders tight with discomfort. Beside him, Miriam sat straight-backed, though exhaustion lined her face. "The church," she murmured, pointing toward the white steeple rising above the rooftops. "Reverend Thatcher will help us." Silas wasn't so sure. He remembered Thatcher as a fiery preacher who'd railed against corruption from his pulpit, but 10 years could change a man. He knew that better than most. They found Reverend Thatcher in his study, a room that smelled of leather-bound books and wood smoke. The preacher's face went pale at the sight of Silas filling his doorway. "Good Lord," Thatcher whispered, stumbling back. "We all thought you were dead?" Silas's voice was rough from disuse. "Not yet." Miriam stepped forward, her manner direct despite her wavering strength. "Reverend, we need your help. Victor Ames is trying to steal my tribe's spring. I have a deed that proves our claim, but we must file a protest before it's too late." Thatcher's eyes darted between them, his hands fidgeting with his collar. "Miss Redbird, these matters are complicated. The railroad has brought much-needed progress to our town. Perhaps some compromise could be reached?" "Compromise?" Miriam's voice sharpened. "Like the compromises that drove my mother's people from their hunting grounds? Or the ones that let Ames poison 3 homesteaders' wells last spring?" The Reverend flinched. Silas watched him closely, seeing the struggle between conscience and fear play across his face. Heavy boots scraped the church steps, and Sheriff Collings appeared in the doorway. Time had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his badge sat crooked on a worn vest. "Heard you were back," Collings said to Silas. "Figured I'd find you here." He removed his hat, revealing gray-streaked hair. "Town's different now, Silas. Ames's men, they don't play by rules you'd recognize. They carry papers instead of guns, but they're just as dangerous." "Some things ain't changed," Silas replied quietly. "Right's still right, wrong's still wrong." Before anyone could respond, Miriam swayed on her feet. The long journey and her recent illness caught up with her all at once. Silas caught her before she fell, his large hands gentle as he steadied her. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" A new voice cut through the tension. Abigail Thatcher stood in the study doorway, her practical skirts rustling as she took charge. "This girl needs rest, not politics. She'll stay here tonight, and Silas too." "Abigail?" the Reverend protested weakly. "If Ames finds out, then let him find out." Abigail's eyes flashed. I won't turn away those in need because some railroad man might disapprove. Have you forgotten whose house this really is? She turned to Silas and Miriam, her expression softening. Come along, supper's nearly ready and you both look half-starved. The parsonage kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the smell of fresh bread and beef stew. Abigail served generous portions, while her husband picked at his food, still unsettled by their unexpected guests. The town's been too quiet since you left, Silas, Abigail said, passing him a second helping. Too many good folks looking down at their boots instead of standing up straight. We could use a man of your stature again. Silas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, which creaked under his weight. Ain't looking to make trouble? Sometimes trouble finds us whether we're looking or not, Abigail replied. And sometimes the Lord puts us in places where we're needed most. She glanced meaningfully at her husband, who suddenly became very interested in his stew. Miriam had regained some color after eating. Mrs. Thatcher, thank you for your kindness, but we can't stay long. The protest must be filed. And it will be, Abigail assured her. But tonight, you rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to face whatever comes. She looked at Silas again, her expression knowing. Sometimes the hardest journey isn't the one that brings us to a place, but the one that brings us back to ourselves. Silas met her gaze briefly, then looked away. Outside the window, lamplight began to flicker in Dry Creek's windows. The town he'd fled was still there, beneath all the changes. And somehow, without meaning to, he'd stepped back into its story. Morning sunlight streamed through the parsonage windows, warming the kitchen where Abigail kneaded bread dough with practiced hands. Silas sat at the worn table, his large frame making the wooden chair seem small. Steam rose from his coffee cup as he watched Abigail work. The wells started going bad last spring, Abigail explained, her movements never stopping. First the Hendersons' place out west, then the Miller farm. Now half the town's water tastes like coal dust. She paused, wiping flour from her hands. Ames claims it's natural seepage, but everybody knows his mining operations are poisoning the groundwater. Silas's weathered face darkened. Reckon that's why folks are after Miriam's spring. It's the last clean water source for miles, Abigail nodded. Pure as heaven's tears, that spring. Been that way since before any of us settled here. The stairs creaked, and Miriam appeared, looking stronger after a night's rest. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and some color had returned to her cheeks. Good morning, she said softly. Child, you should be resting, Abigail chided gently. I heard coughing from the street, Miriam replied. Someone's sick. Before anyone could stop her, Miriam was at the window. Outside, Sarah Jensen hurried past, carrying her young son Tommy. The boy's face was pale, his small body racked with violent coughs. Miriam grabbed her medicine satchel. That's cholera from the bad wells, no doubt. Silas rose. You ain't strong enough yet? I'm strong enough to help, Miriam said firmly. She turned to Abigail. Do you have any wild garlic in your garden? And honey? While Miriam gathered supplies, Silas pulled on his coat. I'm going to see Collings, he announced. Time he remembered what that badge means. The sheriff's office was a small building with peeling paint. Inside, Collings sat behind his desk, cleaning his revolver. He looked up as Silas's shadow darkened the doorway. Figured you'd come, Collings said, setting the gun aside. But there ain't much I can do, Silas. You're the law here. Collings laughed bitterly. Law? The real law comes from that railroad office now. Ames owns the mayor, the judge, even the bank. Without his railroad, this town dies. He stood, pacing to the window. You think I like watching him steal land and poison wells? But folks need jobs. They need supplies. They need that train running. They need clean water more, Silas countered quietly. Maybe so. Collings turned back, his face tired. But I can't help you, not officially anyway. Across town, Miriam knelt beside Tommy Jensen's bed, mixing herbs in a cup of warm water. The boy's mother hovered nearby, wringing her hands. Will he live? Sarah whispered. Yes, Miriam answered confidently, though her heart ached at the child's suffering. But he needs clean water. The well water is making him sick. Other women had gathered in the small house, watching as Miriam worked. Her gentle manner with the boy, the sure way she prepared her medicines, and her quiet strength impressed them. When Tommy's coughing finally eased, sighs of relief filled the room. You have a gift, Mrs. Miller said softly, like them angels of mercy in the good book. Miriam shook her head. Just knowledge passed down from my mother, and her mother before her. Native wisdom mixed with settler medicine. She smiled sadly. The spring water would help him heal faster. It always has. The women exchanged glances. They'd all lost something to Ames's greed. Clean wells, grazing land, even their men's dignity as they bowed to railroad demands. That evening, back at the parsonage, Abigail paced the kitchen as she laid out her plan. We'll gather every woman who's lost a well, she declared. Each one brings a jar of muddy water from their ruined springs. We'll march right up to Ames's office and show him what he's done to our children's drinking water. Silas frowned. Ames won't care about jars of mud. No, Abigail agreed, but he'll care about 50 women standing outside his office, showing everyone what he's trying to hide. And when Miriam presents her deed with all of us behind her, she smiled grimly. Well, even Victor Ames can't ignore that kind of witness. Miriam sat straighter. The women will come? After what you did for Tommy Jensen? They'll come. Abigail's eyes gleamed. Sometimes the Lord works through the gentle hands of healers more than the strong arms of fighters. Silas shifted uncomfortably. It's dangerous. Ames has hired guns. They won't shoot women in broad daylight, Abigail said firmly. Not with the whole town watching. Besides, she added, with a pointed look at Silas, we'll have a mountain of a man standing guard. Miriam touched the silver locket at her throat, her mother's legacy giving her strength. When do we march? 2 days, Abigail decided. Time enough to spread the word and gather our evidence. She looked at Silas. Unless you think that's too soon? Silas met Miriam's determined gaze. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling he'd thought long buried with Clara. Pride, maybe, or hope. 2 days, he agreed quietly. Reckon that's just about right? Dawn painted Dry Creek's main street in pale gold as Miriam and Silas began their rounds. They started with the western edge of town, where the Henderson family drew murky water from their failing well. Martha Henderson listened from her porch, arms crossed, as Miriam explained tomorrow's protest march. Ain't no use standing up to Ames, Martha said, shaking her head. He owns everything from here to the territorial line. Miriam pulled a small jar from her satchel. Clear water caught the morning light. This is from the spring, she said softly. The same spring that kept your grandmother's garden alive during the drought of '49. The same spring that's rightfully ours by law. Martha's eyes fixed on the crystal clear water. She glanced at her own bucket, where brown sediment had already settled at the bottom. My youngest had stomach cramps all last week, she admitted. Bring a jar of your well water tomorrow, Miriam urged. Show everyone what Ames is doing to our children. Silas stood silent, but his massive presence lent weight to Miriam's words. Martha's resistance crumbled as she looked between them. Reckon I could fill a jar, she said finally. Maybe 2. The morning continued this way, door after door, conversation after conversation. Some women needed little convincing, having nursed sick children or lost livestock to contaminated water. Others required gentle persistence, their fear of Ames's retaliation warring with their desire for change. By noon, Miriam's quiet dignity had won over a dozen households. Her knowledge of their families, her skilled hands that had delivered their babies or eased their elders' passing, gave her words authority that no amount of railroad money could match. Silas left her with the Miller women and made his way to the telegraph office. The operator, young Jimmy Walsh, nearly dropped his pencil when Silas ducked through the doorway. "Need to send a wire," Silas rumbled, placing a carefully written message on the counter, to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. Jimmy's hands shook as he read the message about Ames's fraudulent water deed. "Sir, Mr. Ames has an arrangement. He sees all official telegrams first." Silas leaned forward, his shadow covering the desk. "This one goes straight through, son. Now." The telegraph key clicked rapidly as Jimmy sent the message, his face pale but determined. When he finished, Silas placed an extra coin on the counter. "Much obliged," he said quietly. "Might be best if you took tomorrow off. Visit your mama in Silver Creek." As evening approached, women gathered in twos and threes, carrying empty jars to their ruined wells. The sound of pumps creaking and buckets splashing echoed through the darkening streets. At the parsonage, Abigail organized the growing collection of murky samples, each labeled with its source. The sun had just set when horse hooves thundered down the street. 3 riders pulled up outside, their shapes black against the purple sky. Ames's men, led by the scarred enforcer everyone called Dutch. "Hear there's going to be some kind of gathering tomorrow," Dutch called out, his voice carrying in the evening quiet. "Mr. Ames wants folks to know he'd take it personal. Any public disruption of business?" Townsfolk hurried inside, doors clicking shut up and down the street, but Silas stepped off the parsonage porch, his enormous frame unfolding like a shadow coming to life. He walked slowly toward the mounted men, stopping in the middle of the street. "Business seems disrupted already," he said, his low voice carrying clearly. "When honest folks can't draw clean water." Dutch's hand drifted toward his gun. "You've been gone a long time, McGraw. Things work different now." "Some things don't change," Silas replied. "Like the law. Like right and wrong." He took another step forward and Dutch's horse skittered nervously. "Like what happens to men who threaten women and children." The enforcer's face tightened, but he couldn't quite meet Silas's steady gaze. The other riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. "Just delivering a friendly warning," Dutch muttered finally. He wheeled his horse around, trying to salvage some dignity. "Mr. Ames won't forget this." "Neither will we," Silas answered. The riders galloped away, leaving dust hanging in the twilight. For a moment, nothing moved. Then doors creaked open. People emerged onto porches and sidewalks, speaking in hushed, excited voices. Sarah Jensen clutched her sleeping son closer, tears in her eyes. "First time anyone stood up to them," she whispered. "First time in years." Miriam appeared at Silas's side, her face glowing with pride. "You gave them courage," she said softly. Silas looked down at her, remembering Clara's same fierce expression whenever she'd faced down injustice. "No," he replied. "You did that, with your healing and your truth-telling." He glanced around at the gathering townspeople. "I just reminded them they don't have to be afraid anymore." All along the street, women resumed their work, filling jars with contaminated water, visible proof of Ames's crimes. Each muddy sample represented a small act of defiance, a declaration that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Dry Creek would find its voice again. The pale light of dawn crept over Dry Creek's rooftops as women emerged from their homes one by one. Each carried a glass jar filled with murky water, the evidence of Ames's poisoned legacy. The morning air hung crisp and still, broken only by the soft clink of glass and the whisper of skirts against wooden sidewalks. Miriam and Abigail stood at the head of Main Street, their faces set with quiet determination. Abigail wore her Sunday best, a statement that this gathering had the church's blessing. Miriam's simple dress and proud bearing drew strength from both her Cherokee heritage and her grandmother Clara's fighting spirit. "Remember," Abigail called softly to the gathering crowd, "we walk in dignity. We let the water speak for itself. More women joined the group. Martha Henderson with her 3 daughters, Sarah Jensen cradling her sick child, the Miller sisters supporting their elderly mother. Each carried jars of brown, sediment-filled water drawn from their ruined wells. Silas positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, his massive frame a silent guardian. He watched the shadows between buildings, knowing Ames's men would be watching. The morning sun caught the silver of his beard as he nodded to Miriam, signaling the way was clear. The women moved forward in silence, their footsteps falling into a steady rhythm on the packed earth. As they passed the general store, Mrs. Collins stepped out to join them, then the baker's wife and the schoolteacher. By the time they reached the town square, nearly 40 women walked together, their jars held before them like offerings. Victor Ames stood on the steps of his office, his tailored suit pristine in the morning light. His smile never wavered as the women arranged themselves in a half circle before him, but his eyes hardened at the sight of their muddy jars. "My dear friends," he called out, spreading his arms wide, "what brings you out so early? Surely there are more pleasant ways to start our day than this public display?" Miriam stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "We bring you the water you've given our children to drink, the water that's killing our livestock and withering our gardens." Ames's smile grew wider, more practiced. "There seems to be some misunderstanding. I've always had Dry Creek's best interests at heart." He reached into his coat, producing an envelope. "In fact, I was just preparing to announce a generous donation to the church building fund, $500 to show my commitment to this community." A murmur ran through the crowd. $500 could fix the church roof, buy new hymnals, perhaps even start a proper Sunday school. "And that's not all," Ames continued smoothly. "I'm bringing in well diggers from Denver next week, new wells for the north side of town, at the railroad's expense." More whispers rippled through the gathering. Martha Henderson clutched her jar tighter, but doubt showed in her eyes. Sarah Jensen bounced her fussy child, looking longingly at the promise of clean water. Silas stepped forward then, his shadow falling across the office steps. "Mighty generous," he rumbled, "considering you're the one who poisoned the original wells." Ames's smile flickered for just a moment. "Now, McGraw, that's a serious accusation. We all know the drought's been hard on everyone." "Drought didn't put coal tar in the groundwater," Silas said, his quiet voice carrying across the square. "Drought didn't drive copper stakes into the spring bed. Your men did that to force folks to sell." "These are difficult times," Ames replied smoothly. "Progress requires sacrifice, but I'm willing to make things right." He produced another document from his coat. "A settlement agreement. The railroad will provide new wells, plus compensation for any hardship. All we ask is that certain legal matters be dropped." The crowd stirred again, hope warring with suspicion on their faces, clean water and cash in hand versus Miriam's uncertain legal claim to the spring. "Think of your children," Ames urged, his voice honey-sweet. "Why drag this out in courts when we can solve everything today?" Abigail stepped forward, her face troubled. "Perhaps, if the terms are fair—" "The fairest," Ames assured her. "You have my word as a Christian gentleman." The morning sun climbed higher as Ames laid out his promises. New wells within the month, payment for damages, even a small stipend for the church's poor box. One by one, the women lowered their jars. Sarah Jensen was the first to turn away, hurrying home with her sick child. Others followed, their faces a mix of relief and shame. Miriam watched them go, her heart heavy, but her head held high. Silas stood beside her, his massive hands clenched into fists as Ames's smooth words unraveled their careful plans. Within minutes, only a handful remained in the square. Ames's smile had turned triumphant as he rolled up his settlement paper, nodding graciously to the dispersing crowd. "There now," he said softly. "Isn't this better than unpleasantness? Progress comes easier when we all work together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty square, where a few abandoned jars of murky water stood as silent witnesses to promises that rang as hollow as fool's gold. The evening settled over Dry Creek like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. Inside the parsonage's warm kitchen, Miriam stood at the window, her fingers worrying the silver locket around her neck. The sun's last rays caught the tarnished metal, making it gleam dully against her dark dress. "It don't sit right," she said, turning to face Silas, who sat at the kitchen table. "Ames giving in so easy. That man's got poison in his soul deeper than what he put in our water." Silas nodded, his massive frame making the wooden chair creak beneath him. Abigail moved between them, setting out bowls of steaming stew and fresh-baked bread. The familiar scents of sage and rosemary filled the kitchen, but did little to ease the tension. "He's planning something," Miriam continued, taking her seat across from Silas. "I've seen that look before, when the agents came with their false treaties. Sweet words, hiding sharp teeth." Reverend Thatcher paced near the cookstove, his usual careful composure cracking. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. His hands trembled as he gripped the back of an empty chair. He started, then faltered. The others turned to look at him. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have said years ago." Silas set down his spoon, fixing the preacher with his steady gaze. The Reverend seemed to shrink under those weathered eyes. "When Ames first came to town," Thatcher continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "he brought papers. Documents showing how he'd bought up water rights all through the territory. But they weren't real. I saw him forge signatures one night in the church office." Miriam leaned forward, her stew forgotten. "You have proof of this?" Thatcher nodded miserably. "I kept copies, hid them under the floorboards in the church beneath the third pew. My shame was too great to bring them forward, but too strong to destroy them." "We need those papers," Silas said, rising from his chair. The table shuddered at his movement. A sharp crack split the night air. For a moment, they all froze, until the orange glow through the window made their hearts sink. Firelight, coming from the direction of Silas's line shack. "No," Miriam breathed, rushing to the window. "They're burning you out." Before anyone could move, the front door burst open. Sheriff Collings stumbled in, his face pale. "Ames's men," he gasped. "They're coming. They know about the—" The window behind him exploded inward. Collings jerked forward, red blooming across his chest. He collapsed onto the parsonage steps as more shots rang out. "Get down!" Silas roared, pulling Miriam away from the window. But rough hands were already reaching through the broken glass, grabbing at her skirts. Abigail screamed as two of Ames's men crashed through the door. Silas lunged for them, his fist connecting with the first man's jaw with a sickening crunch. But there were more behind him, and one pressed a revolver to Miriam's temple. "Easy now, McGraw," the man drawled. "Unless you want the lady's brains decorating these nice walls." Silas froze, his hands still raised. His eyes met Miriam's, seeing not fear there, but a fierce, burning anger. "You tell Ames," she spat at her captors. "My grandmother Clara knew what he was. That's why she hid the truth about the spring, and I aim to finish what she started." The men dragged her backward through the broken door. Silas took one step forward, but the click of multiple hammers being cocked stopped him cold. "Smart man," one of Ames's thugs sneered. "Stay that way." They vanished into the darkness with Miriam. On the steps, Sheriff Collings groaned weakly, blood seeping between the fingers pressed to his chest. Through the window, the orange glow grew brighter. Silas's line shack, his home for 10 lonely years, was becoming a beacon of Ames's vengeance against the mountain man who dared to stand against him. Abigail rushed to tend to the fallen sheriff while Reverend Thatcher stood trembling in the corner, his earlier confession hanging heavy in the fire-lit room. Outside, Somewhere in the darkness, Miriam was being taken to face whatever cruel plans Ames had laid. Silas stared out the shattered window, his massive frame silhouetted against the distant flames. His voice, when it came, was low and dangerous, as summer thunder over the mountains. "Reverend," he said, not turning around, "those papers you hid, time to dig them up." Behind him, Sheriff Collings coughed wetly, his blood staining the parsonage steps, as Abigail pressed a cloth to his wound. The fire consuming Silas's home painted the night sky an angry red, a warning of the violence yet to come. Silas stood in the parsonage doorway, his massive frame trembling with a fury he hadn't felt in 10 years. Behind him, Abigail pressed clean linens against Sheriff Collings' wound, while Reverend Thatcher hovered nearby, wringing his hands. "Get up!" Silas growled at Thatcher. The preacher flinched at his tone. "You're showing me where those papers are. Now!" Thatcher's face went pale. But the sheriff— "I'll tend to him," Abigail cut in, her voice steady despite the blood staining her apron. "Go with Silas. This has gone on long enough." The night air bit cold as Silas and Thatcher hurried across the empty street to the church. Orange flames still painted the sky where Silas's line shack burned, a reminder of all he'd lost. Again. Inside the church, their boots echoed on the wooden floor. Moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the empty pews. Thatcher's hands shook as he counted down the rows. "Third pew," he muttered. "Help me move it." The heavy bench scraped across the floorboards as they shifted it aside. Thatcher knelt, his fingers searching the wooden planks until he found a loose board. He pried it up, reaching into the dusty space beneath. "Here," he said, pulling out a yellowed envelope. "I've carried the shame of hiding this for years." Silas snatched the papers, unfolding them with careful fingers. Even in the dim light, Ames's forgeries were clear, clumsy attempts to claim water rights that had never been his to take. "All this time," Silas's voice rumbled like distant thunder, "you knew what he was doing. Watched him poison wells, steal land, threaten folks, and you did nothing." Thatcher's shoulders slumped. "I was afraid. He promised to build the church, keep the town alive. I told myself it was for the greater good." "Greater good?" Silas took a step forward, and Thatcher stumbled backward. "My wife, Clara, she tried to stop him. Died in an accident with our baby before she could expose him. And you knew?" "I didn't know about Clara," Thatcher whispered. "I swear it. But you're right. My cowardice has cost too many lives already." Silas's massive fist clenched around the papers, then slowly relaxed. "Ain't time for blame now. Miriam needs us." They hurried back to the parsonage, where Abigail had managed to slow Collings' bleeding. The sheriff lay pale but conscious on a cot, his badge gleaming dully in the lamplight. "Train," Collings rasped when he saw them. "Ames has private car. Leaves at dawn." "He'll try to smuggle her out," Silas said, his mind already working. "Get her far enough away that filing that deed won't matter." A knock at the door made them all freeze. Silas moved to answer it, ready for trouble, but instead of Ames's men, he found Tom Weber, the telegraph operator, and 3 other townsmen. "Saw the fire," Weber said, "then heard shots. Figured it was time somebody stood up to Ames proper." More shapes emerged from the darkness: the blacksmith, 2 ranchers, the general store owner, men who'd looked away from Ames's crimes for too long, shame and determination now mixing on their faces. Silas studied them, remembering how they'd shunned him after Clara's death, but in their eyes he saw something new: respect and a hunger for justice too long denied. "Ames has Miriam," he told them. "Means to put her on the dawn train. We're getting her back." "His men are armed," someone pointed out, "and mean as rattlers." "So we be smarter," Silas said. He spread the recovered papers on a table, weighing them down with a lamp. We got proof of his crimes now, but first, we get Miriam safe. The men gathered around as Silas outlined his plan. The depot had only two approaches, the main platform and the storage yard. Ames would expect trouble from the front, so they'd come from behind, using the pre-dawn darkness for cover. Weber, you're fastest on a horse. Silas assigned tasks with natural authority. Ride for the marshal in Sterling. Show him these papers. Blacksmith will need those tools of yours. Rest of you, spread word quiet-like. I want every man who's willing at the lumber mill by midnight. They nodded, purpose replacing fear in their stance. As they slipped away into the night, Thatcher stepped forward. I should come too, the preacher said. Help make this right. Silas looked down at him for a long moment. You will? But first, them papers need copying. Evidence against Ames, in case anything goes wrong. From his cot, Collings struggled to sit up. Silas, he called weakly. My deputy's got keys. To the jail. Might need them. After... A ghost of a smile touched Silas's weathered face. Much obliged, Sheriff. The men dispersed to their tasks, leaving Silas standing in the parsonage doorway. His eyes found the distant glow of his burning cabin, then lifted to the stars scattered across the dark sky. Somewhere out there, Miriam was counting on him. This time, he wouldn't fail to protect his family. The stars faded as false dawn crept over Dry Creek. Silas McGraw stood at the edge of the train depot's empty platform, his calloused hand gripping a long-handled shovel. Behind him, Abigail Thatcher and 7 other townspeople huddled in the pre-morning chill, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Remember, Silas whispered, his voice barely carrying over the whisper of wind through the telegraph wires. No guns. We ain't here for bloodshed. He studied the depot grounds, marking the positions in his mind. The water tower loomed above them, its iron sides gleaming dully in the weak light. Something in his chest tightened when he thought of Miriam locked up there, but he forced the feeling down. Now wasn't the time for anger. Tom, Sarah, you two take the loading dock, he directed, pointing with the shovel's handle. Keep low behind them cotton bales. Rest of you spread out along the platform. Don't bunch up. The townsfolk moved quietly to their positions. Silas noticed their hands were steady, despite the fear in their eyes. These weren't fighting folk, a seamstress, a shopkeeper, a widow who ran the boarding house, but they carried themselves with quiet dignity. Abigail touched his arm. What about me? Need you by the telegraph office, Silas said. Watch for Weber's signal when the marshal's coming. And... He hesitated. If things go wrong, someone's got to tell the truth about what happens here. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. The Lord sees all, Silas. Justice will prevail. High above them, inside the water tower's maintenance cabin, Miriam Redbird sat with her back against the curved iron wall. Her wrists were raw from the rope binding them, but she kept her breathing steady, focusing on the prayer her grandmother had taught her long ago. Creator who walks before us, she whispered in Cherokee then English, light the path through darkness, give strength to the weary, hope to the hopeless. The space was cramped and cold, smelling of rust and stagnant water. Through a small window, she could see the town slowly emerging from shadow. Her captors had taken her satchel, but they hadn't found the small leather pouch sewn into her skirt's hem. Inside it, pressed flat, was a copy of her mother's birth record, proof of her claim to the spring, and her connection to Clara. A train whistle pierced the dawn, echoing off the distant hills. Miriam closed her eyes, remembering Silas's gentle hands tending her frostbite, the quiet strength in his bearing. She refused to give in to fear. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same dignity her mother had shown in the face of injustice. Below, Silas heard boots on gravel. Ames's men were taking position around the depot, their guns obvious on their hips. 4 of them flanked the private car coupled to the end of the waiting train, while 2 more guarded the water tower's base. He gave a low whistle. the signal they'd arranged. Around the depot, the townsfolk stood up slowly from their hiding places. They carried no weapons, just the tools of their daily work: brooms, shovels, rolling pins, simple things that spoke of honest labor. "Hold steady," Silas called softly, seeing some of them shift nervously. "We ain't here to fight, just to stand our ground." Steam hissed from the locomotive as its crew prepared for departure. The sun's first real rays struck the water tower's peak, making it glow like a beacon. Silas planted his feet wide, the shovel held across his body like a staff. Not a weapon, a symbol of the work that had built this town, the same work Ames's greed had poisoned. He saw Ames's men exchanging uncertain glances. They were used to dealing with fear, not this quiet resolve. One of them stepped forward, hand hovering near his gun. "Clear out," the man ordered. "This ain't your business." "It's all our business," Silas replied, his deep voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "This town's water, its people, that's everybody's business." More townsfolk emerged from the shadows: the baker, the livery stable owner, even old Mrs. Peterson who ran the post office. They formed a loose circle around the depot, neither advancing nor retreating. Their faces showed their fear, but something stronger held them in place: the knowledge that this moment would define who they were as a community. Silas kept his eyes on the water tower, knowing Miriam was up there, probably praying. He'd failed to protect Clara, lost himself in grief and shame for 10 years. But standing here now, surrounded by neighbors who'd found their courage at last, he felt something new stirring in his heart. Not just anger at injustice, but hope, fragile as a dawn flower, strong as the roots that held it to the earth. The train whistle sounded again, closer now. Steam billowed white against the brightening sky. Silas adjusted his grip on the shovel and waited, as still as the mountains that had sheltered him all those lonely years. The time for hiding was over. Whatever came next, they would face it together, standing firm in the light of day. The locomotive's whistle shrieked through the morning air as it approached the Dry Creek depot. Ames's enforcers shifted their stance, hands hovering near their holsters. The rising sun cast long shadows across the platform as Silas McGraw stepped forward, his weathered shovel held steady across his chest. Behind him, a line of townswomen emerged from the morning mist. Each carried a glass jar filled with murky brown water from their contaminated wells. The sight stopped the enforcers in their tracks, 20 women standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces set with quiet determination. "What's this foolishness?" the lead enforcer called out, trying to mask his uncertainty with bravado. His hand tightened on his gun belt as he eyed the crowd. Silas's voice carried across the platform, deep and steady. "No foolishness here, just honest folk showing the truth about what your boss has done to their water." The women raised their jars in unison. Morning light filtered through the dirty water, casting sickly shadows on the wooden platform. Sarah Thompson, the baker's wife, stepped forward and uncorked her jar. The stench of sulfur and rot drifted across the depot. "This is what our children have to drink," she declared, her voice trembling but clear. "What our livestock dies from. What your railroad's greed has left us." More women uncorked their jars. The collective smell made several of Ames's men step back, covering their noses. The power of the silent protest was written on their faces. This wasn't the armed resistance they'd prepared for. Silas reached into his coat, movements deliberate and slow. The enforcers tensed, but instead of a weapon, he withdrew a folded document. The church's hidden deed, yellow with age, but still legally binding. "Got something else to show you, boys," Silas said, holding up the paper. "The real deed to the spring, the one your boss tried to bury." He began reading in his rumbling voice, each word distinct and damning. The document detailed the original water rights, proving how Ames had manipulated property lines and forged signatures. As he read, more townsfolk emerged from the shadows, forming a circle around the depot. Up in the water tower, Miriam pressed her face to the small window. watching the scene unfold below. Her heart swelled at the sight of the women's protest, at Silas standing tall before the armed men. Even with bound hands, she felt stronger, knowing she wasn't alone anymore. The lead enforcer's confidence cracked. He glanced nervously at his companions, then at the growing crowd of witnesses. These weren't the scared, isolated homesteaders they usually intimidated. This was an entire community standing together. "Listen here," he tried again, but his voice had lost its edge. "We got our orders. That woman up there," he pointed to the water tower, "she's coming with us on that train." "No." Silas planted his shovel in the ground like a staff. "She's staying right here in Dry Creek, where she belongs, with her kin?" The word kin rippled through the crowd. Some knew the story now, how Miriam's blood tied her to Clara, to Silas, to the very heart of their town's history. The women raised their jars higher, a wall of witness to the poison that had seeped into their community. "You boys got a choice to make," Silas continued, his voice softening. "You can keep serving a man who'd poison children's water for profit, or you can stand aside and let justice take its course." A young enforcer at the back lowered his gun first, then another. The lead man looked at the crowd of witnesses, at the women with their jars of death, at the giant mountain man holding nothing more threatening than a shovel and a piece of paper. His shoulders sagged as the fight drained out of him. "Ames didn't tell us about no deed," he muttered. "Didn't say nothing about poisoned wells neither." "He wouldn't," Silas replied. "Men like him never do." The morning light strengthened, burning away the last shadows around the depot. The train's whistle sounded again, closer now, but the enforcers' ranks had broken. They stepped back from the water tower, from the private car, from the weight of truth they couldn't deny anymore. Abigail Thatcher hurried forward from the telegraph office, waving a yellow paper. "Marshal's coming," she called out. 10 minutes out with the territorial agent." The lead enforcer looked at the telegram, at the deed in Silas's hand, at the jars of poisoned water. His decision was written on his face before he spoke. "Get the woman down," he ordered his men, "and somebody find her satchel. This ends now." The crowd's tension broke like a fever. Women corked their jars, men stepped forward to help, and 2 enforcers hurried up the water tower's ladder to free Miriam. Silas stood watch, his shovel still planted firmly in the platform's weathered boards, as the morning sun rose fully over Dry Creek. The crunch of hooves on gravel cut through the morning air as the territorial marshal's horse rounded the corner. Marshal Cooper dismounted with practiced ease, his badge catching the sunlight. Behind him, 2 deputies followed on horseback, their expressions grim, as they took in the scene at the depot. Victor Ames burst through the depot door, his polished appearance now disheveled. His eyes darted between the marshal, the crowd of townsfolk, and his wavering enforcers. The mask of civility he'd worn for so long began to crack. "Marshal Cooper," Ames called out, straightening his vest. "There seems to be some confusion here. These people are interfering with railroad business." "Save it, Ames," Marshal Cooper interrupted, his weathered face stern. "Got some interesting telegraphs about you. Fraud, water rights violations, kidnapping." He gestured to the women still holding their jars. "And whatever this mess is—" Ames stepped closer to the marshal, lowering his voice. "Now see here, Marshal. Surely we can come to an arrangement. The railroad has considerable influence in the territory. A man in your position could benefit from—" "Are you attempting to bribe a federal marshal, Mr. Ames?" Cooper's hand rested casually on his holster. Before Ames could respond, hurried footsteps sounded on the platform. Reverend Thatcher pushed through the crowd, clutching papers in his trembling hands. His wife Abigail stood proudly at his side. "Marshal Cooper," Thatcher called out, his voice stronger than anyone in Dry Creek had heard in years. "I have a confession to make. I've been complicit in Mr. Ames's schemes." He held up the papers. "These documents detail every bribe, every falsified deed, every threat made against our townspeople. I signed them all as witness." Silas shifted his stance, moving slightly to shield Thatcher from Ames's furious glare. The Reverend continued, his words tumbling out like a cleansing flood. I let fear silence me while our people suffered, while our water was poisoned, while good folks like Silas McGraw were driven into exile. Thatcher's voice cracked. I'm ready to face whatever punishment comes, but these papers prove Ames's guilt beyond doubt. Marshal Cooper took the documents, scanning them with practiced eyes. The platform fell silent except for the soft clink of glass as the women lowered their jars of fouled water. Deputies, Cooper called out, take Mr. Ames into custody. Ames's face contorted with rage. You can't do this. I own this town. I own all of you. Not anymore, Silas rumbled, his deep voice carrying across the platform. He turned to Ames's enforcers, who stood uncertain and leaderless. Time to choose, boys, like I said before. The lead enforcer looked at his men, then slowly unbuckled his gun belt. The others followed suit, laying their weapons at the deputy's feet. No shots fired, no blood spilled. Just the quiet surrender of men who'd finally seen the truth. Get the woman down from there, Marshal Cooper ordered, nodding toward the water tower. Two deputies climbed the ladder while Silas watched, his shovel still planted firmly on the platform. Moments later, Miriam emerged, squinting in the bright morning light. Though her wrists were raw from the ropes, she walked with dignity, her head held high. A cheer erupted from the crowd as Miriam descended the last few rungs. Women rushed forward, embracing her, offering water and comfort. Abigail Thatcher wrapped a shawl around Miriam's shoulders, while Sarah Thompson pressed a clean handkerchief into her hands. The deputies led Ames away in handcuffs, his threats fading into impotent mumblings. Marshal Cooper turned to Reverend Thatcher, his expression softening slightly. Your confession will help the prosecution, Reverend? The territory takes a kindly view of those who make things right in the end. Thatcher nodded, his shoulders straighter despite his shame. Abigail squeezed his hand, pride and forgiveness mingling in her tears. The crowd began to disperse, women carrying their jars of poisoned water like evidence of both corruption and courage. Miriam made her way to Silas, who still hadn't moved from his post. You can put the shovel down now, she said softly, touching his arm. It's over. Silas looked down at her, his eyes bright with emotion he couldn't quite express. He nodded once, lifted his shovel, and together they watched the sun climb higher over Dry Creek, its light touching clean and corrupt waters alike, promising a new day for them all. In the days that followed, Dry Creek stirred with new life. The spring, once poisoned and contested, flowed clear again. Cherokee elders blessed the waters in a ceremony that drew both tribal members and townsfolk, marking the first time many had shared sacred ground together. At Silas's line shack, the sound of hammers rang through the crisp mountain air. Men who had once whispered about him now worked alongside the giant, passing boards and sharing meals. Even Reverend Thatcher joined in, his soft hands growing calloused as he helped rebuild what Ames's men had burned. Miriam moved between both worlds with grace, her medical bag always at hand. Where doors had once closed at her approach, they now opened wide. She delivered Sarah Thompson's baby, treated the Cooper boy's fever, and taught willing women the healing ways her mother had passed down. Sheriff Collings, his shoulder healing well under Miriam's care, made it official one morning at the general store. Silas, he said, pinning a deputy's star to the big man's vest, reckon you've been protecting this town better than I have? Silas touched the star with weathered fingers, remembering a time when such trust seemed impossible. The town gathered at the church one evening, drawn by Abigail Thatcher's invitation. Lantern lights spilled from the windows as people filled the pews, ranchers, shopkeepers, tribal members, and railroad workers who'd chosen to stay. We've seen what strength lies in standing together, Abigail announced from the pulpit, her voice carrying to the back rows. Let's make this service a new beginning for Dry Creek. She smiled at Silas, who sat in the last pew, no longer hiding in shadows. For all of us. The congregation nodded in agreement, and for the first time in 10 years, Silas felt the weight of loneliness lift from his shoulders. He had found his way home. The wooden pews creaked as Silas lowered his massive frame into the front row beside Miriam. Strange, he thought, how natural it felt now to sit where everyone could see him. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass, casting rainbow patterns across their shoulders. Miriam's silver locket gleamed at her throat, Clara's locket, a testament to the family bonds they had discovered. Reverend Thatcher stood at the pulpit, his voice stronger than it had been in years. We have witnessed how justice flows, not from the barrel of a gun, but from the courage to stand together, he said, his gaze meeting Silas's, from the grace to forgive and the strength to begin anew. The congregation murmured in agreement. Silas felt dozens of eyes upon him, but for the first time in a decade their gazes held warmth instead of judgment. His large hand, once used only for solitary labor, rested gently on Miriam's shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable mere weeks ago. When the first hymn began, voices lifted in harmony. Miriam's clear alto rose above the others, and Silas found himself humming along, remembering words he thought long forgotten. As they sang, the church doors swung wide on their hinges, as if pushed by an invisible hand. Golden morning light flooded the aisle, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny stars. Through the open doors, Silas could see the distant spring, its waters catching the sun's rays. The stream flowed freely now, belonging to no one and everyone, just as it should be. Children played near its banks, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Cherokee and settler children alike, sharing the same precious water. Silas straightened his back, no longer bearing the weight of isolation. Here, in this moment, he was whole again. Here, he was home. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.